Arizona Territory, March 1886. The wind kicked up dust along the platform in Benson as the train hissed like a beast caged too long. Josette Bellamy stood with her gloved hand curled tight around a one-way ticket to San Francisco. Her trunk had already been loaded. Her boots were clean. Her coat buttoned to the throat. She looked like a woman ready to leave for good, but she was not really. The ticket trembled in her hand. She had not slept in 3 nights. Not since the last of her father's debts came due and the ranch her home, her mother's grave, her whole life was lost to the bank. She had no family left in Arizona, no reason to stay, except one. The sound of boots crunching grit behind her made her heart flare. She did not turn. She already knew it was him. "Still holding that ticket, Josie?" His voice came low and steady. She closed her eyes. "You should not be here, Vance." "I know." She turned. Vance Vaughn stood 5 paces off, coat unbuttoned, hat in hand. His hair was sun-bleached at the ends. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over the Santa Ritas. He looked older than the boy who used to sneak her apples from the schoolhouse window, but not by much. He looked like home. "I heard about the ranch," he said gently. Josette's throat tightened. "I am not your responsibility." "I never said you were." He took a step closer, then another. I cannot let you go without saying what I came to say." She blinked fast. "You should not make this harder than it already is." "You have that ticket in your hand," he said, nodding toward it. "But what if I asked you to trade it for a life with me?" Josette's breath caught. "I do not have money," he went on, voice rougher now. "I do not have land. But I have a good horse. I have work out near Patagonia, and I have enough saved to set up a small place, nothing big, but it would be yours, ours, if you want it." She stared at him, her chest ached. "You are offering me a hard life," she whispered. "It would be," he said. "But not a lonely one." Behind them, the conductor called, "All aboard." The train hissed again. Josette looked at the ticket, then at him. "I had a room waiting in San Francisco," she said. "A seamstress job lined up, nothing fancy but safe." Vance nodded. "You can still go." She stepped forward, pressed the ticket into his hand. "I do not want safe," she said. "I want you." His eyes burned. "You sure?" She nodded. He reached for her hand, curled his fingers around hers. "Then come with me." They walked off the platform together, her hand still in his, her trunk forgotten. They rode out that afternoon on horseback, side by side. Vance took them south, toward a patch of land he had been eyeing near the Sonwooda grasslands. He spoke little, but every so often he would glance at her with a look that said more than words ever could. That night they camped under mesquite trees, stars scattered thick above them. Josette sat by the fire, her knees drawn up, a blanket around her shoulders. "I never thought I would leave Benson," she said quietly. "I never thought I would have the nerve to ask you," he replied. She smiled faintly. "What changed?" He looked at her a long moment, then said, "You did." Standing there with that ticket, it was like watching the last light go out of something good. I could not let it happen. Josette turned toward him, watching his face in the firelight. "I was ready to go," she said, "but I hoped just a little that you would come." His voice dropped. "You hoped," she nodded. He reached across the space between them and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I am here now." Their eyes held. Then slowly he leaned in. She met him halfway. The kiss was soft, steady, grounding, not wild, not rushed, just right. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I never needed a city," she whispered. "And I never needed anything but you," he murmured. They slept close that night, not tangled, just near enough to feel each other breathe. In the morning, they packed up and kept riding south. Josette had traded her ticket, and she did not regret it. Not for a moment. The trail turned narrow by late morning, winding between rocky hills thick with ocotillo and creosote. Josette rode behind Vance, her mare picking careful steps along the dry arroyo bed. The sun climbed steadily, though a breeze off the higher ridges kept the heat from settling too heavy. Her coat was strapped behind the saddle, her hands, ungloved now, bore the dust of the trail. They passed no one. Midday brought them to a shallow spring tucked into a fold of stone. Vance dismounted without a word and led his gelding to water. Josette followed suit, her boots crunching softly as she stepped down and loosened the bridle. She knelt by the edge, cupping water to her mouth, then let it run over her wrists. Beside her, Vance had taken off his hat and dipped it full, pouring it over the gelding's shoulder. He glanced her way. "You saddle sore yet?" She wiped her face on her sleeve. "I'll live. You always did have grit," he said, settling back on his heels. Josette sank to a seat on a flat rock, pulling her braid over one shoulder. "When I was 16, I rode out to Tumacacori with nothing but a broken cinch strap and a borrowed mule. I remember heat like this. You went alone. I didn't wait for permission. My mother was sick. I went to fetch a healer." She twisted the end of the braid in her fingers. "Didn't help in the end." Vance sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You never told me that. You were off working cattle. Besides, it was a long time ago." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on her face. "You always carried things quiet. I noticed that even back then." Josette looked out at the shimmer of distant hills. "Some things don't have words." They rested there until the heat eased. Vance carved a strip of jerky with his knife and passed her half. She chewed slowly, letting the salt pull her back into the moment. As they packed up, he spoke again, quieter. "The land I'm taking you to, it's not much to look at yet. Scrub and wind, but the soil's soft under the dust. I figure it'll grow. I'm not afraid of work. I know you're not, but I want you to know this life won't be gentle to you just because I love you." Josette paused, reins in hand. "You've never said that before." "I didn't know if I had the right." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You don't need the right, you just need to mean it." His breath caught and he nodded once. "I do." They rode on as the light changed. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the land. Somewhere behind them a hawk cried once, then disappeared over the ridge. By evening they reached a small rise overlooking a shallow valley. Vance pulled his horse to a stop and pointed. "There." Josette followed his gaze. A few cottonwoods edged a dry creek bed below. Tucked into a slope beyond, half buried in earth, stood a single-room adobe. The roof was patchy, the door off its hinge, but the chimney held. Smoke hadn't risen from it in years. She said nothing for a while. "Then, whose was it?" "Belonged to an old miner. He died near 5 years back. I've kept an eye on it ever since." "You think it'll hold through monsoon?" "With some patching. I've got tools stashed under the floorboards." She dismounted and walked toward it, her boots brushing dry grass. Inside, it smelled of dust and old stone. A battered stove sat in the corner, rusted but intact. Light filtered through the broken door onto a dirt floor swept clean by wind. Vance leaned in the doorway. "It's not a house yet, but it could be." Josette turned back to him. "Then let's make it one." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and for the first time it felt like a beginning. Vance lifted the sagging door off its hinges the next morning while Josette sorted through the canvas bundle he'd retrieved from beneath a floorboard. It held a hammer, a few bent nails, a stub-handled saw, and a coil of wire so rusted it flaked red onto her fingers. She shook her head at it, then stepped outside, brushing her palms clean on her skirt. The light was thin and gold, stretched across the grasslands like a blanket left out. Josette squinted toward the cottonwoods. A pair of quail darted from the brush, chittering low. She caught herself smiling. "You need help with that?" she asked, nodding toward the door he now had braced on 2 flat rocks. Vance looked up, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. "If you can hold it steady, I can square off the bottom." Josette knelt and pressed her hands to the wood, steadying it as he drew the saw through with even strokes. The sound rasped in the quiet air, sharp and certain. When the door was trimmed and rehung, neither perfect nor pretty but solid enough, Josette leaned against the wall and crossed her arms. "You ever built anything before?" she asked. "Not much," he admitted. "Helped raise a fence line once out near Sonoita. Mostly watched older hands do the thinking." "Well, we'll learn," she said, "or we'll patch it wrong and live in a crooked house." He grinned, just faint at the corners. "A crooked house with you in it's better than a fine one standing empty." She turned away, not because his words unsettled her, but because they settled too deep. They spent the rest of the day gathering what they could. Vance led her to a half-collapsed shed behind the house where he'd stashed a roll of canvas, a dented tin pot, and a pair of old wool blankets. Josette shook the dust from them and laid them across a line strung between two nails. When she found a small wooden crate tucked behind a broken barrel, she opened it and laughed softly. "Button jar," she said. "Must have belonged to someone's wife. Think she'd mind you taking them?" he asked. "She's not likely to come back for them now." They boiled water over a fire pit Vance cleared just beyond the cottonwoods. Josette brewed coffee with the last of the grounds from his saddlebag while he cleaned out the cracked stovepipe. They ate dried beans and hard bread, dipping the crusts into the bitter brew. When the sky turned violet, Josette sat on the threshold of the doorway, legs drawn up beneath her skirt. Vance joined her, his back against the cool adobe wall. "You ever think you'd end up here?" he asked. "I thought I'd marry some merchant," she said. "Someone with clean fingernails and a quiet voice. I thought that for a long time." He didn't answer right away. A coyote called somewhere far off, and now, he asked. "I think I was wrong about what I wanted." He looked at her, but she didn't meet his gaze. "I never expected you to wait for me," she went on. "Not after I turned you down that first winter. You were burying your mother," he said. "I understood. I didn't." Vance shifted, his shoulder brushing hers. "You don't owe me anything, Josie, I know," she said, "but I want to give you something anyway." She turned toward him then, her face lit faintly by the rise of the moon. Her hand found his, fingers curling into his palm like they belonged there. "You gave me a way back to myself," she said. "Even before I knew I was lost," he exhaled softly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. I don't feel it. You don't have to." They stayed like that for a long time, their hands folded together, the night full of crickets and the slow hush of wind through the grass. Later inside, they laid the blankets side by side across the dirt floor. Josette unpinned her hair as Vance unbuckled his boots. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When she lay down beside him, he reached for her, not urgent, not unsure. Just steady. She turned into him, her head resting just beneath his collarbone, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. In the darkness, she whispered, "Do you think it'll last, this life?" His voice came warm against her hair. "We'll make sure it does," and she believed him. Josette rose before the light touched the floor. The air inside the adobe was cold enough to sting her hands as she pulled on her dress and stepped into her boots. Vance was still asleep, one arm crooked beneath his head, his breath even and slow. She stepped outside quietly. The sky was palest gray, the kind of color that only lasted a few minutes before dawn found its footing. Josette crossed to the creek bed, crouched and washed her face, the water sharp and clean. Her fingers numbed, but she stayed until the chill cleared her head. A clutch of mule deer moved in the distance, ears flicking, legs slender as reeds. She watched them until they vanished between clumps of juniper. Behind her, the house looked smaller in the half-light, but it was theirs now, stitched into the morning like a promise. Vance joined her not long after, shrugging on his coat. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, shoulders broad and still, his breath visible in the cooling air. "You always rise this early?" he asked finally. "Only when I need to feel like I've got a say in the day," she answered. He nodded, rubbing his jaw. "That makes sense." They worked side by side through the morning, hauling stones to shore up the back wall where the foundation had slumped. Josette found a rusted spade in the shed and cleared out the dry brush along the edge of the yard. Vance patched over the hole in the roof with scavenged boards and a strip of canvas, his hands steady, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat by noon. When they paused, she brought out a small cloth bundle she'd packed from her saddlebag, a heel of bread and 2 boiled eggs. She handed him one and sat beside him on the log they'd dragged near the fire pit. "You always this quiet when you work?" she asked. He cracked the shell and looked over. "Only when I'm trying not to think too far ahead." Josette peeled her eggs slowly. "What's ahead that's got you cautious?" He rested his elbows on his knees. "I've never built anything lasting before, not with someone else's hands in it too." She took a bite, chewing slow. "That scare you?" He looked down at the cracked earth beneath them. "Not the work. Just the weight of wanting it to be enough." Josette leaned back slightly, watching the sky. "I don't need much, Vance, just a roof that doesn't leak and a man who tells the truth." He looked over at her, something quiet rooting in his expression. "You'll get both." That afternoon, they rode to a nearby rise where Ocotillo lined the ridge like sentries. Vance showed her the shallow path that led to the next valley where he said water pooled longer into summer and mesquite grew thick enough to cut for fence posts. "You thinking fences already?" she asked, adjusting her seat in the saddle, thinking chickens, maybe, a goat or two. "If I can trade in town for lumber, we could board up the shed proper." Josette turned her mare in a slow circle, taking in the sweep of land. The wind tugged loose strands from her braid, carrying the scent of creosote and sun-warmed stone. "I could sew," she said. "Take in mending or make dresses, that'd bring coin." "I remember you stitching your own cuffs in school," he said. "You'd always fold them twice so the thread wouldn't show." She smiled faintly. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about you," he said, not looking away. Josette felt the words settle in her chest like something long awaited. She didn't answer right then. Just turned her horse toward home, and he followed. That evening she stood by the doorway, watching the dusk spill over the valley. Vance brought up a single wooden chair he'd found buried in the weeds and set it beside the hearth. She ran her hand along the worn armrest, then looked at him. "We'll need another," she said. "I'll make one," he replied without hesitation. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve. "This doesn't feel borrowed anymore." "No," he agreed. "Feels like it's ours now." He reached for her then, not with urgency, but with the same quiet certainty that had drawn her off that platform days ago. She stepped into his arms, her fingers resting against the curve of his shoulder. They didn't speak. Outside, night settled full and dark. Inside, they stood still and close, something invisible passing between them, solid as timber, quiet as breath. Their lives had begun. Not with thunder, but with the sure sound of two people choosing the same road. Rain came 2 weeks later, sudden and hard, blown in from the south with a sky gone almost black by midday. Josette stood at the doorway and watched it roll in, arms crossed, apron damp from gathering the wash too late. The sheets were already soaked, clinging heavy and useless to the line. She didn't move to save them. Some things were not worth the scramble. Vance came up from the shed with his hat pulled low and a coil of wire slung over one shoulder. He ducked under the eaves and shook the rain from his sleeves. "You see the lightning?" he asked, glancing west. "Lit up the ridge like a lantern," she said. He passed her the wire without a word and stepped inside, boots leaving prints across the packed dirt. She followed, closing the door against the wind. They sat for a while in the quiet. The roof held, though water dripped steadily from the corner where canvas met wood. Josette placed a tin basin beneath it and returned to the hearth, where the fire Vance had built that morning still burned low. "You ever have a storm tear through like this up in Benson?" he asked. "Once." Took the roof off the feed store and dropped it on the livery. Nobody hurt, but it sent the preacher into a sermon about wrath. Vance chuckled under his breath. "Wrath don't have much use out here. Storm comes, you brace and hope what you built holds." Josette looked at him. "And if it doesn't, then you build again." The rain drummed harder, a steady rhythm like hoofbeats. She reached for the sewing she'd left beside the stove, a torn shirt of his, worn thin at the elbow. Her fingers worked the needle through it while he leaned back against the wall, watching the fire. "You ever miss the trail?" she asked after a while. He didn't answer right away. "I miss riding fast sometimes, wind in your face, sun behind you. But I don't miss sleeping cold or never knowing where you'll become next week." She tied off the thread and bit it clean. "I never knew where I'd be week to week either toward the end. I guess I just didn't move as much." "You move plenty now," he said, nodding toward the mended rows of onions behind the shed. "That bed you dug's coming in strong." She folded the shirt and set it aside. "You think we'll stay here long term?" "I don't see why not," he said. "Land's ours in all the ways that matter. There's water close and I've seen deer come down the slope at dusk. We can make a good go of it." Josette stood and walked to the narrow window. The storm had begun to pass, light filtering through the gray in faint streaks. "There's a part of me," she said softly, "that still expects the ground to fall out from under this." Vance joined her, his palm settling at the small of her back. "The world's never been steady, Josie, but I'm here and I'm staying." She turned then, slowly, and looked up at him. Her fingers found the front of his shirt, still damp across the shoulders. "Then I'll stay too." He kissed her, not like the first time, not with the hesitance of beginning, but with the quiet weight of something rooted. The next morning, the soil was soft beneath their boots. They planted squash and beans, their hands working the earth with practiced movements. She wiped her brow and laughed as he tried to chase off a bold jackrabbit with a shovel. By late summer, the adobe had a second chair, rough-hewn and uneven-legged, but steady. Josette kept a ledger in a tin box beneath the bed, where she noted every trade she made in town: 3 shirts mended for a sack of flour, 2 dresses for a pair of hens. Vance built a pen from mesquite posts, and they took in a goat from a neighbor who'd lost his wife and couldn't manage the herd alone anymore. They didn't talk much about the past. There was no need. It lived in them quiet, as things do when they've been turned over and settled. In the evenings, they sat outside with their knees touching, sharing bread and whatever stew she'd managed from the stove. Sometimes he played the mouth harp he'd dug out from an old bundle. Sometimes they just listened to the night. A year passed, then another. They married under the cottonwoods one April afternoon, with the creek running high and the air thick with blooming sage. The man who sold feed in town read the vows. Vance wore his best shirt. Josette stitched her own dress from flour sacks she'd bleached in lye and sun. She didn't cry. But her hand shook when she said his name, and he steadied it with his own. They built a porch that summer, small and crooked, but shaded just enough to keep the wind from biting. Vance carved their initials into the post nearest the step. By the time the cottonwoods turned gold again, she was showing. He ran a hand over her belly one evening, quiet and careful, like reverence. She caught his wrist and held it there. They never spoke of what they'd lost before each other, but everything they had now stood in answer to it. The house never did sit quite straight. The stove smoked when the wind shifted. But the roof held through 5 more storms. The onions came back every spring. And their children grew up with dust on their boots and laughter in their lungs. And Vance never stopped watching her like she was the clearest thing he'd ever seen. They lived long. And they lived well. And they never left.